You ever notice how people make these like crazy money decisions, like just wild stuff, pouring tons of cash into something super risky or hanging on to an investment that's like clearly tanking?
Yeah, totally.
But the thing is, and the sources you sent really highlight this, it's rarely because someone's actually, irrational.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's way more nuanced than that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into this. It gets really fascinating, I think, when you start to see how.
Well, the logic behind those seemingly like off the wall choices, it often comes down to personal experience, like
Mhm.
your own financial world. It kind of shapes your whole understanding of money, sometimes in ways that would really surprise you.
Totally. And that is exactly what we're going to deep dive into today. We're going to explore just how much our own personal histories, like the specific times we've lived through, have this huge, but often invisible influence on our financial lives.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how much we don't realize it's going on.
Right. And the stuff you sent over, it really gets into the psychology of money, gives us some incredible insights into why we all behave the way we do with it.
Yeah, and if we can like connect this to the bigger picture for you, our mission today is to understand how these vastly different life journeys, different experiences lead to such different viewpoints on everything money, from saving and spending to like investing, managing risk.
Yeah, all of it.
Right. And by looking at all sorts of examples, we're talking someone who built wealth through extreme frugality, all the way to like tech leaders who've navigated those crazy boom and bust cycles. Hopefully, we can all become a little more aware of our own like financial biases and get a better sense of where other people are coming from. You know what I mean? It's all
Exactly.
about understanding each other, right?
Okay, so let's kick things off with something really basic. The power of your own personal experience with money. It's kind of mind-blowing how much your direct encounters with money, even if there's just a tiny sliver of like global financial events, can end up totally shaping your core beliefs about how the whole system works.
It's powerful stuff.
Right. It could be something like 80%, did you say?
Yeah, something like that. The research is really fascinating. It basically says your fundamental beliefs about money are shaped overwhelmingly by your direct experiences with it, even if those experiences are, relatively limited in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, so let's get specific here because I think this is where it gets really interesting for people.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some examples of, contrasting experiences and how they might lead to totally different financial outlooks?
Okay, imagine like someone who grew up with real scarcity, facing financial
Yeah.
insecurity. Their whole idea of risk and reward is going to be fundamentally different from someone who, let's say, was raised in a wealthy banking family. For the person who's known hardship, the potential downside of any financial loss, it can feel catastrophic, like life or death almost. And the person who's always had that safety net, they might not truly grasp that feeling no matter how hard they try.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about like rich versus poor,
Right.
right?
No, not at all.
Someone who lived through, let's say, crazy high inflation, totally unpredictable, they'll have a completely different gut reaction to rising prices than someone who's only ever known like relative price stability.
Totally. They'll probably react a lot faster, try to get ahead of it.
Right. Or think about like a stockbroker who lived through the Great Depression, those devastating losses, versus, say, a tech worker who came up during the dot-com boom in the late 90s.
Huge difference.
Huge. Their perspectives on market volatility, worlds apart. I mean, one might be really cautious, the other might be more willing to ride the waves, so to speak.
Exactly. And even like where you live, broader economic conditions, all that plays a role too.
Yeah.
Like the sources point out, an Australian who's lived through 30 years without a recession is going to have a different baseline understanding of economic stability compared to someone, say, here in America who's seen multiple downturns.
Right. It's like we're all living in our own little financial bubbles, kind of shaped by our pasts,
Okay.
and it's hard to see outside of that bubble.
Yeah, the sources call it like experiential blindness. We're blind to the experiences we haven't had.
That makes sense. There's actually a really interesting anecdote about John F. Kennedy in the materials you sent.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So during the 1960 election, he was obviously in the public eye during the Depression.
Right.
But because of his family's wealth, immense wealth, he actually had no firsthand experience of hardship. In fact, his family's fortune actually increased during that time. Crazy, right?
Wow.
And that lack of understanding, that direct experience, it became a really big deal in the election.
That makes sense. And it raises a really interesting question, I think, about learning about financial history, secondhand.
Yeah.
Like, studying the past is valuable, of course, but it can't truly replicate the emotional impact of living through it. You can read all the stats, all the analysis, but you won't have the same gut feeling as someone who, like, lived through a market crash, experienced that profound loss and uncertainty firsthand.
That's such a good point. Like, you can understand market crashes intellectually,
Yeah.
but you can't truly feel the fear and uncertainty unless you've been there.
Exactly. Michael Batnick, the investor, he put it really well. Some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood. It really makes you think about how anchored we all are to our own lived realities.
Totally. Okay, so we've been talking about how powerful personal experience is when it comes to shaping our financial views.
Yeah.
And, we talked about those generational anchors a bit.
Right.
You sent over some research by economists Malmendier and Nagel, I think their names were.
Yeah, they did some fascinating work on how generational anchors can affect investment decisions.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit so our listeners can see how it might apply to them. What did they find exactly?
Well, their research looked at decades of data on what Americans do with their money. And what's really interesting is that they found people's lifetime investment choices are significantly influenced by the economic conditions they experienced, particularly early in adulthood.
So it's not just about what the market is doing right now or what specific investment options you have.
Exactly. It's about the economic environment you grew up in. Like, those early experiences can create what they call generational anchors. And those anchors can really influence your understanding of financial concepts and your risk tolerance. The big takeaway here is that your early financial experiences create lasting biases, and these biases often have a bigger impact on your investment decisions than rational analysis does throughout your whole life.
Wow, so it's almost like, I don't know, like the dumb luck of when and where you were born, as you said.
Yeah, in a way it is.
Okay, so give us some more concrete examples.
Sure. Let's say someone comes of age during a period of high inflation.
Yeah.
Later in life, they might be way more cautious about investing in bonds compared to someone who grew up with stable prices. Because their formative experience, it taught them that inflation can eat away at the value of those fixed income investments.
Right. Makes sense.
And on the flip side, you have people who were young adults during like a really strong stock market period. They're more likely to invest heavily in stocks later on because they saw firsthand how quickly things can grow.
So our investment strategies aren't just based on, like, objective analysis and spreadsheets.
No way.
They're also based on these emotional memories, the residue of our early financial experiences.
Exactly. And you know what Malmendier and Nagel concluded? They said an individual's willingness to take on financial risk depends significantly on their personal history, not just their IQ or how much financial education they have.
That is humbling, isn't it? It's like so much of our financial outlook is shaped by things that are totally outside our control. The materials you sent even mention Bill Gross, the famous bond manager. He believes his success was tied to being born at a specific time that coincided with a long-term decline in interest rates, which was obviously great for bond prices.
Yeah, he's a smart guy. He definitely understood that. And if you think about it, his experience with bonds as these wealth-generating machines, it was likely really different from his father's generation.
Right, because they lived through.
They lived through times of much higher inflation and might have seen bonds as, well, much riskier.
It's wild to think about how something like a bond, which seems pretty straightforward on the surface, can be perceived so differently based on your generation and what you've lived through.
Totally. It all comes back to that experiential blindness we were talking about.
Right. Okay, now I want to get into some even more extreme examples, if that's possible, because we've been talking about, like, different generations. But what about events that create, like, radically different financial realities across the globe?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. And to understand this, you got to consider the impact of major global upheavals. Like, think about World War II.
Okay.
So in Germany and Japan, their stock markets were basically wiped out. Entire regions were just devastated.
Yeah.
But during that same period, the U.S. market more than doubled. The American economy was booming. Even basic necessities like food security were totally different between these countries.
That's just like an unimaginable difference in financial realities to wrap your head around.
It is. And think about it. Someone living through that devastation in Europe or Asia, they're going to have a completely different understanding of concepts like inflation, stock market investing, even just the basic value of money compared to someone thriving in the U.S. at the same time.
That's a huge point, right? It goes back to our mission here, understanding how different life experiences lead to such vastly different financial perspectives, it's a reminder that we all have these biases, often unconscious ones, based on our own limited view of the world.
Absolutely. Those groups we were talking about, they'd have totally different views on inflation, stock market, unemployment, money in general. You can't expect them to respond to financial information the same way, trust the same sources, or even agree on what truly matters financially. Their whole worldview was formed in completely different circumstances.
Right, and this idea of radically different financial realities, it helps explain why people sometimes make financial choices that seem completely baffling to others, right?
Exactly.
Which leads us to our next point.
Which is understanding the logic behind those seemingly illogical choices. Right. What's really important to understand is that every financial decision, no matter how strange it might seem from the outside, makes perfect sense to the person making it at that moment. They're operating based on their own unique mental model of how the world works. And that model, it's been shaped, intricately shaped by their experiences.
Okay, so can you give us an example?
Yeah, think about lottery tickets.
Okay.
Now, it might seem counterintuitive that lower income households often spend a bigger chunk of their income on lottery tickets than other groups, despite the odds being so slim. From a purely rational standpoint, it's hard to justify.
Right, it doesn't make sense on paper.
No, it doesn't. But you got to consider the bigger picture. For someone facing limited economic opportunities, struggling to make ends meet, a lottery ticket can represent hope. It's a chance, even a tiny one, for a life-changing event when other paths seem blocked.
That's powerful. It reminds me of that statistic that 40% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency, yet many of them still buy lottery tickets.
Exactly. It highlights the desperation, the longing for a way out. It's not just about the rational probability of winning, it's about the emotional value of that potential life-altering event. And it's something to think about in your own life. Where might you be making choices that seem irrational on the surface, but are driven by deeper hopes or fears?
Totally. Like, yeah, we all make those choices sometimes. And it really underscores the point that financial decisions are rarely just about the numbers, right?
Wait, not at all. They're tied up with your personal history, your ego, social pressures, and all sorts of incentives, both rational and emotional.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a concept that many of us take for granted: retirement.
Yeah, retirement.
It's easy to assume that the expectation of a comfortable retirement has always been there, but the sources you sent suggest that's not really the case.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The widespread idea of being entitled to retirement. It's only about 2 generations old, really.
Really?
Before World War II, most Americans worked until they died. Like the labor force participation rate for men over 65, it was over 50% well into the 1940s. Retirement as we know it, this extended period of not working, living off your savings, that wasn't the norm.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So even when Social Security was introduced, the benefits were pretty small, right?
Yeah, they were modest, for sure. The first check in 1940, adjusted for today's dollars, was only like $416 a month. And it wasn't until the late 60s that the poverty rate for those over 65 really started to drop significantly.
So the expectation that we have now of a dignified retirement funded by savings and investments.
Yeah, that really only took hold in the 80s. And think about how new key retirement savings vehicles are, like the 401k in 1978, the Roth IRA in 1998. It's no wonder so many people struggle with saving for retirement. We're all kind of new to this whole thing.
That's a good point. Okay, let's move on to another fascinating and often overlooked aspect of financial outcomes: the interplay of luck and risk.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because they're really two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah. They are. And, what's interesting is that they both represent forces that are largely outside of your control, but they play a huge role in shaping how your life turns out, especially financially. As Scott Galloway says, nothing is as good or as bad as it seems.
And the materials you sent have some great examples of this, like the story of Bill Gates.
Yeah, Bill Gates.
Incredible success, but he himself acknowledges that 1 in a million stroke of luck of attending one of the few high schools in the world that even had a computer back in the late 60s.
Unbelievable, right? I mean, that early access gave him a huge head start. But then there's the contrasting story of his friend, Kent Evans, who was just as talented.
Oh, right.
Gates's close friend from Lakeside. He experienced the 1 in a million tragic risk, dying in a mountaineering accident before he could even start to achieve his potential. It's a stark reminder that for every success story we see, where we attribute everything to skill and hard work, there might be someone just as capable who faced a completely different kind of luck.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. And it makes you realize how we tend to attribute other people's failures to bad decisions.
Right.
But when it's us, we blame bad luck.
It's so true. And, the media often focuses on the lucky rich without really acknowledging the role of chance. And those who are skilled but unlucky, well, their stories often go untold.
Absolutely.
And think about Vanderbilt. His famous quote, "Ain't I got the power?" While his actions did lead to massive wealth, those same actions could have just as easily resulted in failure if luck hadn't been on his side. It's hard to know the difference between a bold decision and a reckless gamble until after the fact. It often comes down to whether you were lucky or not.
And even Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing,
Oh, right.
his single biggest success, his investment in Geico, it actually violated his own diversification rules.
Wow. It makes you wonder, what really defines a good decision, when luck plays such a big role?
Yeah. Gaines himself said, "Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose."
Hmm.
But the materials you sent make another crucial point. Failure can be a lousy teacher too, because it can make us overthink mistakes that might have just been the result of risk, the inherent risk that comes with anything worthwhile.
Right. Failure can make you too risk averse.
Yeah. So the key takeaway here seems to be about building resilience, structuring your financial life in a way that helps you survive those inevitable setbacks, knowing that luck and risk are always at play.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that idea that nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. We need to be aware of the influence of luck and risk, both in our own lives and in the lives of others, so we don't judge too quickly.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, can we summarize the key takeaways for our listeners?
Of course.
Because there's a lot to digest here.
Yeah, for sure.
So the main takeaway, I think, is that our individual journeys through life, the specific economic and social landscapes we've encountered, have shaped our understanding of money in ways we often don't even realize. What seems totally logical to one person can be totally baffling to someone else. And that's okay.
Absolutely. And because of that, it's so important to take some time to reflect on your own formative financial experiences.
Yeah.
Like, think about those events that might still be subtly influencing your perspectives and your financial decisions today.
Right. And then try to imagine how might someone from a different generation, a different background, view the exact same financial situation you're in.
That's a great exercise. It really helps you develop empathy and understanding.
Totally. And recognizing the influence of personal history, along with the unpredictable roles of luck and risk, it can help us understand all the different financial behaviors we see around us, right?
Exactly. And that awareness can be incredibly valuable. It can help you navigate your own financial life with more self-awareness and help you better understand the perspectives of others, which can be really helpful in all sorts of situations.
So we shouldn't judge so quickly, right?
Not at all. I think the most important thing to remember is that by acknowledging these powerful forces at play, the impact of our past, the role of luck and risk, we can start to move beyond those simplistic judgments and appreciate the complexity of individual financial realities. There's always more to the story than meets the eye.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. This was a really insightful conversation.